The way we'll run questions is that don't sit down, because you're going to sit out here along with Peter and Karl.
To take a seat.
And the thing to do is to address your... I've got questions, I'm sure you have too. So please address your question to whichever member of the panel is engaged with this. And it might be a good idea if when they respond they come and stand here at the podium. That way they can be amplified. So, gentlemen at the back.
One for the young lady. You didn't mention candy.
Yes.
Do you have anything to say, comment on that?
I surely do, yes. The constraints of a 15-minute speech meant that I didn't get to mention everything I would have liked to have. Of course, Candy had different Red Cross centres operating there as well, which are really important to truth. I believe that the Red Cross operated sort of 3 different centres there. So they had one in Colombo, at Candy, and another at Trincomalee, if I'm saying that correctly.
Trincomalee?
Trincomalee, yes. Thank you. But yes, that's what I would say on Candy as well. So it was another significant location there during the war. Does that answer your question? Oh, yes.
I've got another question. Meghan, in terms of, say, the VADs, not so much Red Cross, but were these people paid? Were they purely volunteers, or were they sustained in Sri Lanka?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. It's one that has a little bit of a complicated answer. So the voluntary aids had their roots in the Red Cross and were initially a voluntary organisation. But during the Second World War, I think it was around 1940, they were actually taken sort of into the army, where they were sort of employed and paid as privates, basically. And during the war, the name of the VAD was actually changed to the Australian Army Medical Women's Service. And they had their uniforms changed and all different things to kind of distinguish between the sort of civilian voluntary aid detachments and then those who are actually working in support of the army. So they would have been paid for their service at this time, but they do kind of have their roots in that Red Cross nurse kind of situation that we often think of when we think of women serving in these roles. Yeah, does that answer your question?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, while we've got you, can you tell us about you mentioned the obscurity of this subject. I mean, all of the subjects that we've dealt with this morning have been obscure, but can you talk about the complexity of digging these stories out from sources that appear to have been scattered, the process?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think like many of my fellow authors, it was a research process for us because we're looking for things that are not well known, and so trying to find these stories can be quite interesting at different times. I found Trove to be a wonderful resource for this, just to identify a number of different individuals who were serving in these places, particularly with publishing of letters and things in different newspapers and reporting on their work there. There are some fabulous different sources in the National Archives and the records of the Australian War Memorial that talked about the establishment of the hospital at Colombo, and a number of excellent books on this topic as well. But it was really, it was quite a joy to put it together, really. I mean, it's nice to kind of uncover such interesting and sometimes funny stories that we haven't heard of before. And so I think, like others who have contributed to the book, it was really just a fabulous opportunity to delve into an area of history that I didn't know much about before, and I'm really pleased to know a little bit more about it now.
Thank you. That's all we. Thank you.
The VADs who returned to Australia in 1943, did they just go back to civilian life, or what was the general trend amongst them?
You have to read the book to find out now.
I have, I was just handballing it too.
So yes, a lot of them continue their roles with the VAD, or the Australian Army Medical Women's Service. One of the women who was actually sort of the leader of this first group of volunteers, her name was Margaret Stevens. She actually went on to continue serving with this service and went to Singapore at the end of the war, where she was assisting former POWs. But a lot of these women did maintain their association with the service. Others, like Gladys Collins, who I mentioned, she ended up joining the Red Cross while she was there instead. And she actually ended up meeting a British lieutenant while she was there, and they were married in Kandy, I think, in 1944. So they sort of all spread out to different areas, but I do discuss what happened to some of these women later on in the book, and so buy a copy and you can find out.
Thank you. Questions for Karl and Peter? Anthony?
Karl, I was wondering, with Force 136, when they were operating behind Japanese lines inside Burma, how were they received by the local Burmese people?
Oh, it really varies depending on the operation. So some local groups and tribes responded quite well to the SOE operatives, depending on the time of the war, as during the duration of the war. So sometimes they supported the British, sometimes they were indifferent. So there are also various different groups within Burma itself who use them to fight against each other, because it's a multinational, multiracial group in Burma. So it's really quite patchy. There's two excellent books. If you're really interested in this topic, there's a book by Richard Dunkett on SOE in Burma, and there's another book on SOE in Malaya, which I strongly recommend you read, because they both examine these sources in much more detail than I was able to. But in the main, it's pretty patchy. So some of the SOE groups, the Burma local, say NAD groups, for example, they responded well. Others are working with the Americans. And from 44-45, it's more positive, whereas in 42-43, it's not very good, because the Burmese have a sense that the British have abandoned them. So while we do have these and they're tiny little groups parachuting in behind the lines into Japanese-controlled territory, the Burmese, much like many other peoples in the region, like, well, why would we help you guys? We've just left and abandoned us. So it's quite mixed. In Malaya, just to go off a little bit, when the SOE drop into Malaya, particularly in 44-45, the response from the Malay and the Chinese is also very mixed, somewhat reluctant, and like many of those groups that the SOE supports in the European theatre, they're interested in training and weapons, but not necessarily to fight an aggressive war against the Japanese. And really, many of those, particularly the guys for both Kata and Pontoon in Malaya, they comment in their diary that the Chinese, because they're largely Chinese guerrillas, they want to be trained, but they're just waiting until Japan's defeated and the British come back, and so they want to fight against the British, because that feeds into that post-colonial sense. So in terms of a military asset, it's pretty patchy, but they did provide intelligence. However, there's an overwhelming response of intelligence that the SOE field parties gathered. When it's processed, it's almost like too much information. So it's really hard to get a critical sense of, we know what they did, we know where they went, sorry, you have a sense of what they did, but how effective was it is up for endless interpretation.
Thank you. Gentleman at the end.
Question for Peter. Graham Sligo is my name. Peter, with the correspondence, you get examples like Chester Wilmot, New Guinea, writing a detailed operational report for RAL that RAL's very impressed with. Apart from the military intelligence point that you mentioned, do you get many analytical reports done privately or post-war by correspondents? Because, early in these campaigns, there's a lot of failure and a lot of learning and adaptation that occurs.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any substantial papers written. A number of the correspondents wrote books, both during the war and after the war, but they concentrated upon more tactical issues rather than deep-seated analyses of the campaign itself. There was also a lot of criticism. Some of the journalists had come from Australia, South Africa, and they didn't like the sort of class system that they found in India and in Burma. And there were some criticisms of the British there. But I'm not aware of any really detailed reports after the war. Can I just, I've got a question for you.
Well, I've got a question for you.
As you know, Australian troops were returning from the Middle East, and Churchill, I think, didn't even inform the Australian Prime Minister, and they're going to be diverted to Colombo and then to Burma. Would it have made any difference if an Australian division had been sent to Rangoon?
Well, it would have made a huge difference to the 8th Division, to the 6th and 7th Divisions, because they would have been captured.
Would have been correct.
Yeah, it would have been disastrous. Yeah. We can disagree about the circumstances of the diversion, but not now. Can I ask you, while we've got you, you mentioned Ian Fitchett.
Yes.
And Ian Fitchett became not just a legendary Canberra figure,
That's right.
a well-known Canberra identity, especially in the pubs of Canberra,
Yes.
but he was also a colleague at the memorial for a time. Did he overlap with your time?
No, I can't
Speak up, please. So for us deaf people down the back.
Sorry, I can't remember him at the War Memorial. Ian Fitchett was an interesting guy. He actually joined up. He was in the 2nd 4th Battalion, and then so he joined the RAF, and then was made a correspondent. Now, he was made an official correspondent, could have used the officer's mess and that sort of thing, but in his reports he used to refer himself as Sergeant Fitchett. And he was not beyond using his fists on occasion.
Yeah, that's right. Fascinating character.
Yeah.
Other question? Well, Andrew's got a question.
No, I've got a question for Karl.
Well, let's get Karl back up.
That's all right, Karl, stay there, stay there. I just wanted to comment on Tony's question about how the, I think it was Tony's question about how the local populace reacted to these SOE parties and so on. And of course in Burma, Force 136 was quite very successful in building networks of guerrillas, particularly in the Japanese retreat over the Situng River in 45. They had nearly 30,000 guerrillas ambushing and shooting up the Japanese. But they were shams, and the other successful areas were Karens and Nagas, Kachins. So the lowland, if we call it, the ethnic Burmese, which mostly occupied the river valley, were far less sympathetic to the British. And the tribes that lived up in the groups that lived up in the mountains, the highlands, didn't like the Burmese any more than they liked the Japanese. So they generally were, in a way, loyal to the British, if that's the right word, and helped Force 136 and indeed the American Office of Strategic Services teams 101 and 104 that were in Burma to great successes by the end of the war. So it just helps to explain a little bit. The Burmese themselves were the ethnic Burmese. You could, particularly with downed pilots, for example, often discovered on the one hand that they were horrible and nasty and anti-British and chopped them up, and on the other hand you had villages that were quite friendly and gave them help and succour and got them back to their units. So it's a mixed bag among the Burmese.
And you just sketched out the ethnic tragedy that is modern Myanmar, haven't you?
Yes,
It was
indeed.
a civil war that's continued for 40 years.
A question for Karl. So in general terms, we might say that the Americans in the war in Burma were looking to ensure that the Burma road stayed open, that the Chinese were supplied, whereas it could be said that the British were more concerned with maintaining their empire, and that the road to China was of secondary importance. So I'm interested that at the time that the military mission was being formed, it was a British mission looking to train people to reinforce in China. Why? It seems just a bit of a dichotomy of views.
Well, basically, there was a dichotomy of views, and at times SOE and OSS, so the British intelligence and the American intelligence services, were at cross purposes and often competing with each other, particularly during that latter part of the war in China. Because while Mission 204 mission wrapped up, the British continued later on in several attempts, and the Americans also did a similar sort of effort. And the latter efforts were more successful in terms of getting and coordinating with the Chinese. However, that's partly because the war more overtly turned against Japan, so the Chinese had more of a say in the fight. But certainly SOE, it seems as though, and this, where we don't really know because there's so many gaps in the records, but SOE is certainly involved with that look of Britain's, the return of influence of Britain to Southeast Asia. So you also have these sort of, hence why SOE is operating in Malaya. And you've also got a connection between SOE and SOA, so the Australian Special Operations Special Operations Australia. And almost the suggestion is that SOE planted operatives or agents or officers into SOA and secretly reporting on SOA's activities, i.e. separate from Australia, going back to Britain. And that's also partly why there was that push to drop operations into covert operations into India in 45, because Britain wanted to recontrol, to reassert their colonial influence in that region. So there's certainly cross purposes. There's a lot more at play beyond just trying to resist and push back and fight against the Japanese.
Yeah, thank you. Can I just comment on that? I think Karl's absolutely right there. Several years ago, I had an MA candidate called Gary Followill who did a book called Operation Kingfisher, and his research bears out exactly what Karl's just said, that there's a war against the Japanese, but there's also competition between the imperial powers, and Australia gets caught up in the middle. And arguably, Australian POWs don't get rescued from Borneo because of this this covert war. Yeah. I'm sorry, now.
As a comment, if I may.
Yes, go ahead.
The other reason that there was this dichotomy you were talking about, Karl, was that the British were on the nose with the Chinese.
Yeah.
They felt that the British had offered them assistance, but they weren't able really to follow through because they were under attack by Germany and there was no resources. So the Chinese felt the British had let them down, and this was sort of a cheap man's way of giving the Chinese, showing that they're giving them some support, right? But it was so ineffective, it was fairly useless. So.
Just a comment on that. Wilfred Bircham got very upset because he's in China, and China offered to send Chinese troops into Burma to help the British, but the British knocked them back, at least initially.
That's correct. They did initially knock them back, yeah, until they started.
I don't know your name.
Common four-letter word.
Colin.
No, a common four-letter word, B-I-L-L.
B-I-L-L. Bill. Bill and then Darryl.
Dr. Karl, you mentioned SOA. How does that also mean SRD, Special Reconnaissance Division, or is that sub that or above that? Or?
No, just to confuse the matter. So Special Operations is, well, the intelligence organisations went through different forms. So basically SOA, or Special Operations Australia, because of the similarity with the Special Operations Executive, so SOA and SOE sounded quite similar. So the SOA use the code word the Services Reconnaissance Department. So often people talk about SRD, or the Services Reconnaissance Department. They mean SOA. Often too, commonly, SRD has become, or Z Special Unit has become a catch-all phrase for everything. Is often used incorrectly, hence why I was trying to use SOA. But it is, as in Special Operations Australia, but it is very confusing and often misquoted in all over the shop. And the dudes themselves, those who serve with the unit, not the dudes, but those individuals often didn't know the backstory, what was going on. So they themselves didn't know. Often people say, oh, it's Z Special Unit. It's like, actually, Z Special Unit was purely an administrative unit that looked after Australian soldiers in the AIF when they were posted to SOA or SOE or something like that.
Could you just explain for the benefit of most people here, I'd say, what M Special did then?
So largely, M Special looked after those individuals who performed as coast watchers in operating places such as New Guinea, and other parts of the Pacific, so more along the lines of coast watchers, whereas your Z Special typically operated in other parts of, also the Pacific, but did more deep insertions, reconnaissance and patrols, not necessarily coast watching. But again, there's a bit of a blurring, and some individuals were like Len's sister, for example, so he was the Australian soldier who's the photograph of him about beheaded. He served in both, but he didn't know that we died. But he didn't know either, because it's purely just an administrative function.
Therefore, did M Special fall under command of RAM, or was it independent? The coast watching organisation was a different element because it all became hoovered up. It depends on the time, really, because it varies during the course of war. 42 is very different to 44 or 45, and these things get hoovered together. And it's, I can't remember off the top of my head, but Coast Watchers were a naval organisation-ish, but then it became part of the wider intelligence organisation. There's heaps of different things.
It sounds to me like there's another conference for military in special operations. Now I've got a forester hands up. The order is Darryl, Jan, Anthony, and then somebody in the back row. Yes.
Okay. Karl, given that there were 30 plus Australians on Operation Chur, most of them made it back home, what learnings would then apply from that mission, says he with his taking his cheek, to other special operations that Australia were involved in?
None.
That's the kind of answer I like.
No, so I thought you said none.
He did.
He did.
Jan?
Yeah.
I'm a bit confused about the SOE, SOA, right? Because the people that I've interviewed, like Sir John Holland, etc., they all referred to SOE. And the other thing is we, of course, had headquarters for SOE here in Melbourne, near the Botanic Gardens there. What's the name of the street? I can't remember.
Domain Road.
Domain Road, yep. I was on the corner and whatever. Please, I mean, where did this SOA come?
Don't look at me, look at him.
Oh, you said it was confusing, it really is.
It is confusing, and they were both operating around about the same time-ish. It was all around about 41 and 1942, but they have different forms and different name changes, and because it was very rarely, because of the veil of secrecy around it, people at the time didn't really know, and I think a lot of it's purely administrative, the difference in terms of functions and how it was all gathered together, eventually under sort of MacArthur's general headquarters. But it is vague and overlapping, and they were cross purposes, and so, and often we'll compete with each other for resources as well, in addition to training, recruiting and personnel, and that's partly too where you don't really get much of a crossover of ideas or training methods, for example. So while I sort of flippantly said there were no real lessons learned from the blokes who went to China Tulip course, so 10 of those 40 plus members did go on to Z Special Unit and then SOA, but most of them who returned, such as Bill Noonan, for example, were just absorbed back into the wider Australian Army. There was no effort to debrief them, there was no effort to gather any sort of lessons learnt, and they weren't kept together to then become more of the specialised force. They just were spread across the wider Australian Army. And in the main, the Australian Army had a reluctance about special operations because there was a concern about you taking the best and brightest individuals to go to cherry picking them to go off in these operations that will actually spend a lot of time to train them. Very, very resource heavy in terms of training, weapons, techniques, possible deployment for very possibly limited effectiveness. So there was a reluctance with the Australian forces to even let these men go. And what they did go is surrounded secrecy. So Jowick, for example, yep, everyone celebrates that, but when the guys came back, nothing was talked about it. So there was no celebration of it being a special forces raid the way you do today. It was all done in great secrecy. So to what point really is the question you can ask.
Comment, if I may? SOE actually set up SOA in its original form.
Well, I should think it would.
And Mad Mike Calvert, who was a naval brigadier in Burma, Chittids, he was actually training Australian Commandos and Special Forces guys in Victoria on the Mornington Peninsula, and then he was sent off to Burma, and he became the trainer, one of the main trainers at the Miamio Bush Warfare School, which the Australian Commandos went to. So there's this interconnection, and as Karl
they're
said,
already figured it out in 1941, because you also have the formation of independent companies, various other sort of groups. So it's all working as they go. Because remember, special operations was a brand new thing. It only kind of emerged at the very start of the Second World War. Italians and then Germans were doing what we would now describe as special forces, which then the British picked up and then later on the Americans. So everyone's kind of feeling their way as to what this thing is going to be, what it is, what it could be, but then also how do you employ it.
Thank you. Anthony.
My question's for Peter. I'm also thinking as a former journalist that the people you're talking about are often working in very remote areas and under very difficult circumstances. And as a journalist, my first thought is, how did they actually file their stories? How did they get their stories out into the wider world?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Unless they had some sort of a communication with them, and they didn't, some of them had to travel 1,200 miles to file a story, often 100 miles, 200 miles, and then they might be faced with the censor stopping a lot of the stories. But they just didn't have satellite communications to get it out straight away. So it might take a little bit of time for it to actually get out. And some became very, very frustrated with it.
David?
I'm fourth.
No, yeah, but you keep busting in it. You're not.
I have a question.
Yes, well, you have to wait your turn.
Hopefully for Karl, and hopefully this might just be the last confusing question. Was SOE essentially a British imported unit into Australia while SOA was an Australian raised unit? Is that how we distinguish it? Or
Kind of basically, but there's crossover. And as Andrew mentioned, there's also a crossover of personnel. So you kind of bring in the first individuals were British military, British Army. They came to Australia. They trained, they sort of trying to develop this capability. People like Spencer Chapman, for example, and various others. So you do have this strong crossover, but also some of the people who posted into British officers who came to establish what will become SOA, they didn't reveal that they're actually SOE. So they're spying on their own intelligence organisation they're setting up. And I think because as the war continues, Australia becomes and operates quite closely, obviously, with the Americans. And so the British are concerned about the American influence on Australian operations and Australian, I think, officers. Hence the Brits are sort of spying on them, as in sort of spying on SOA. So it's all very confusing. And this stuff there's so many gaps in the records, it's really, really hard to know. At the end of the war, because also too, we talk about SOE, but there were other British intelligence organisations also in rivalry with each other. So when the war ends, SOE, again, super secret organisation, it culled a lot of its records. They then handed its records over to another British intelligence organisation, which culled the records even further because they wanted to make SOE look. There's this war between the two groups because SOE took up so many resources. So anyway, the second group culls the records again, and then what's left essentially ends up in the National Archives of the UK. And even though people were based here, all those records were extracted to the UK. So you don't really, so then you're over there. It's only starting to be opened up from the 1970s or 80s onwards, so you've got big gaps in the official records. Meanwhile, we know some individuals who deployed on the ground kept their own personal papers as their wants. That's how we know a little bit about them. But then you have a massive veil of secrecy on top of that with the Official Secrets Act. They weren't allowed to talk about their operations. And when members, even Australians who seconded to SOE, when they were discharged from SOE at the war's end, they had a little form saying, you're not allowed to talk about this, just official secrets still obliged. If you do, you can go to jail, here's a fine. You can say, and I've given a very brief cover story, saying, I was in the war and this is my boss, but they couldn't talk about it. And what we find too is a lot of people actually passed away before the stories about SOE started to come out. And there's also, particularly in the Far East, the Pacific, a tiny number of memoirs that were ever written or ever published, whereas now you can get more and more records about SOE in Europe. Guys men and women dropping behind the lines in occupied France. You just don't get that. So from that 720, from those 720 women, for example, Richard Duckett has identified as working with SOE in the Far East, he's only found 3 women who published their memoirs. And the other thing you see, because often those women were a little bit older, because they were trained professionals or they hadn't married, which is why they became trained professionals, then have those skills to become secretaries of Cyphernets or the like. They'd also started to pass away and die off before the official secrets started to be lifted. So there's just lots of things we don't know, and that's also why it's really confusing, and it's a handful of scholars are really working, and I'm just following in their footsteps. If you are interested in the topic, buy the book, look at it, and look in the section where I say for further reading, and check out those sources.
Thanks, Karl. Expertly explained. Is there anyone in the room whose name isn't Andrew Kilsby that has a final question? Andrew.
I have a question for Meghan, actually. Meghan, you mentioned the 2nd 12th Australian General Hospital in Ceylon. Why was it there? And was it connected with the Australian brigades that camped in Ceylon for 3 months on their way back to Australia?
That's a good question. So it was brought there because they were anticipating that there would be fallout from the Japan's invasion of Malaya and from other conflicts going on in the region. So they felt that would probably be a place where they might need a hospital, and that's why they were initially sent there. As I mentioned, they were later taken over by the 50th Indian General Hospital, where the facilities were.
Where was it sent from?
Where was the hospital sent from? That's a great question. I'd have to find out for you. I know that they sailed from Australia, obviously there, but I'm not sure what their movements were after that.
So they went from Australia to Ceylon?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've had an excellent session, 3 excellent and punctual papers, extensive discussion. To me, this is the model of what conferences should be. As I keep saying, conferences are for conferring. And we've had a lot of conferring this morning. We'll go to lunch in a second, and there will be more conferring over lunch, and then sessions after lunch where I hope they'll follow the same model that the speakers and yourselves have established through this excellent session. So give yourselves a round of applause, and especially any messages from the organisers, Jason, Darryl, Andrew?
Lunch will be served in a moment. They're just getting the last of the crayfish. Oh, sorry.